for tuning in to Ask a Beer Economist. I'm Michael Uhrich, former chief economist at the Beer Institute, and I am here live now with my friend Andy Seeger. Andy, you want to introduce yourself some?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Andy Seeger. I'm an economist working in the cannabis space. Mike and I worked together years ago at Miller Coors. Since then, have bounced around the beer space, handling some insights in Constellation, handling their craft portfolio when they had a craft portfolio, and other things. And now we've spent the last little bit of time here in cannabis, kind of managing the consumer insights and market landscape of regulatory business, all sorts of those things as cannabis flows through the nation to almost a nationwide status.
Yeah, cannabis is getting to be pretty well accepted across the whole country, as far as I can see. It's even in the places where it's not legal for I don't know how you prefer to say it. Adult use is
Adult use, yeah.
Let's say
recreational implies some things that we would rather not like implied by this industry.
Right. Okay. So let's say adult use, but even where it's not legal for adult use, it is legal throughout most of the country for at least medical use. I think
and huge. Oklahoma right now has one of the largest medical markets. They grabbed about 7% of their population in the first year as they really opened up almost as a free market. There were really no limitations on qualifying conditions, no limitations on what a dispensary had to do license-wise or getting a license. There were limitations, but all of a sudden you have 2,000 dispensaries in Oklahoma, and we would never have thought that a couple of years ago. So rapidly changing landscape.
That's amazing. Yeah. So what Andy and I thought we'd do is get on here and answer folks' questions. So we took questions online. We've got the chat function here on the YouTube page, and for anybody who is watching and has questions, we'll be fine to take some live questions as well. So if it's good with you, Andy, I'm just going to start into these questions. So
fire away. Let's do it.
You have some too. The first question we got was, okay, so this question, Andy and I were talking about this a couple of minutes ago before we started. The question assumes a certain amount of information, so I'm going to expound on it a little bit. The person asked where you think share in beer will come from when it goes to cannabis, and the person is asking which beer segment, like the mainstream segment, the craft segment, the economy segment, things like that. And so I kind of think that that's jumping the gun a little bit, and here's why. First, we need to talk about whether or not cannabis is likely to take share from beer, take share of people spending from beer. And as I've talked about in beer trade press and speeches at a few places, my research shows that on average, there isn't much happening in terms of is it mostly substitution? Is it mostly people using cannabis and alcohol together? And the evidence that I've seen is it's at least mixed to the point where we don't see a net effect either way. And I've looked at it very deeply. I've modeled it at the county level using information on adult use cannabis tax collections by county by month in the states where adult use is legal. And, that's pretty granular data. We get a few thousand observations in just a few states and a few years that they've had those things legal, and the net effect is zero. So what that means is either there is no substitution or complementarity happening, or it means that there's aggregation bias masking the fact that there are offsetting uses. Some people may be using cannabis and alcohol, specifically beer, as substitutes, and some people may be using them together, but the net effect in aggregate is zero. So I've looked further then into, okay, what are the types of people who are doing one thing versus the other? And what I found in my research is that the evidence actually suggests that it depends on income. So if you can only afford to have beer or cannabis for a particular evening, then people are choosing to have one or the other. In higher income groups where people can afford to do both, and people are doing both. And to me, my research didn't quite get into things like segments, but that bit about income actually implies some things already about segments. What it says to me is if it's higher income people who are less likely to be substituting between cannabis and beer, then you're going to see less substitution effects in the segments that perform well among higher income people. And the segments that do best among high income people are craft, premium, imports. The hard seltzers are in sort of that super premium price point space, and premium and economy are more heavily consumed by people with lower incomes. And so I'm hypothesizing only that there would be more substitution happening between cannabis and beer in those lower price point segments. That's a hypothesis. I think that it makes a lot of theoretical sense. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, having been in the beer world, having worked with some beer people now on the cannabis side.
Whoops. Go ahead, keep going.
Oh, okay. On the cannabis side, I think the beer giants are looking at low single digits when they're modeling things. And I think one of the things we have to remember is that cannabis is still rather nascent in terms of market across the United States. So your research looking backwards is absolutely correct. Those substitutive effects are kind of mingled and muddled as we can't really pull them out yet, as consumers have still not gotten totally used to legalized marijuana, legalized cannabis in these markets. The other thing is we're starting to see whole new segments of demographics come into cannabis. So within the last year or two, a very big uptick in usage for boomers. They're using it for insomnia, chronic pain. They have the discretionary income and the time, and they might have used before something that Brightfield Group called a boomerang, someone that comes back to it. So this is kind of going forward is one answer, and going backward might be a little bit of different answer. I think the younger generation doesn't view a separation between THC and ABV as much as some of us do. There's also a rather healthy black market out there that's just always existed, and people have been drinking and smoking this entire time. This would just enhance the amount of exposure that cannabis has as a legal good for those people that are either afraid of the black market or unconnected or whatever the reason is that they're out of the market. So we've seen that mass acceptance start to flip. It's up to 60% nationwide support whole legalization. That's a huge, huge movement. And that's being seen by, the beer giants. They're up in Canada doing joint ventureships to make soft drinks with THC. They see the future of this. And I would think a little bit of that has to be fear of what's coming. The others are just looking for margin as distributors. Their 30% is just getting squeezed and squeezed by their additional offerings to their clientele. So there's some very big beer people in the cannabis space trying to hedge their bets and hoping that it's only low single digits. The answer to the question of what will it steal from is likely premium lights. I mean, everything steals from premium lights. Every new thing that comes onto the market is going to steal from premium lights. That's where almost everything sources their growth from because of the decline in just the mass of those light beers. When we looked into craft and working on craft at Constellation, about 10% of the craft drinker is your traditional beer nerd. They're super into it, and the kind of curve there is amount of interest and amount of variety they seek. So if that's the 10% that is really interested in seeking a ton of variety, the other 90% is mostly just looking for accessible, easy drinking blonde ales or other things like that. They're not really getting too deep into the hop bombs or anything else. So they're looking for that. And we saw craft companies come after that consumer a couple of years ago with their push into lagers and larger pack sizes whether it's Bell's Original, and they're thinking that if we can get a consumer to drink Bell's Original, they'll probably like Oberon, then they might step up to Two Hearted. That's a path. So that's still playing out as well. So we've seen craft come down and all this kind of blending into these segments as the segments were blurring so much as I was studying it in the beer world. So the easy answer is premium lights. The macro answer is probably a little bit from everything. I do believe this younger generation thinks of THC and ABV just kind of in a more collective as an offering. They place them within their occasion needs, their need state. So the industry is starting to look at it as total mood management. How do you want to alter your mood at a given time? With alcohol being very much a 4 p.m. till bar close in most cases, THC is morning to night. You can use it for your creaky knees in the morning. You can use it for a concert in the evening, and then you can use it for insomnia when you want to go to bed. And that's the same product all the way through health, wellness, entertainment. So this does have a lot more breadth and depth to it that is possible in it than beer might as an occasion. So I hate to hedge and say that the jury's still out. The classic economist lament of we just have to get more data, but I do think there is going to be some cannibalization when this comes. I do think that when these Canadian LPs with the beer giants swing into high gear, they're starting to bring their CBD drink offerings down here. Canopy up in Canada has their soft drink line now of 4 products up there. They're looking at the space. They're heavily invested. So something about that tells me that they're either very scared or they want to jump on this early, or probably a combination of both. Whether it amounts to the low single digits, that's still billions of dollars. That is still a collective that is larger than the declines of premium lights in the past couple of years combined. So, the market does have to be aware of it, even if it's low single digits.
Yeah, that's a good point. About the beverages, you mentioned that there are people doing cannabis beverages. It's not something that I personally have seen a lot of. Is it something that's very big here in the U.S.?
It's not terribly big. The problem with that was emulsification techniques. So THC needs to be bound with fats mostly. It's not really water soluble. So Keith Villa, the inventor of Blue Moon, now has a THC beer out there on the market, has been working hard to do that, where it's got about 10 milligrams. And that's the question we get a lot. And we have it in the lineup of how do ABV and THC equate? We can talk about that. But his offering has about 10 milligrams, and it hits, as he claims, kind of like a light beer buzz. It does have that delay of edibles, and edibles are working on that rapid onset bioavailability that lets you take in more of the THC that you bought, so bang for buck. Other chemistry advances have really happened in the last year or so, where we're getting to the point now where Canopy feels comfortable coming out with their deep space offering in Canada, or Lagunitas or Heineken Jr. now, I guess, has their offering that they've partnered with someone else to make for them. So these offerings are here. At the beginning, they're still really rudimentary here in the U.S., but Canada is kind of being used as a laboratory up there for these big beer giants to explore that space. But the drink business is growing. It's still only about 1% to 2%, even less in total cannabis. Flower is still heavily dominant. Flower is bud, the thing you'd think of getting in a tiny baggie, all those kind of things. We've seen the onset of vapes and cartridges and just this proliferation of format sizes. And now price points and pack sizes are starting to become of interest as, companies gear after single use or sample use. How do you get someone to sample a product, a newbie, a kind of curious person to come in and try a vape for the first time? Well, you kind of give them a 0.1 gram instead of a full half gram or a gram. So, it's a very weird world, but that drink space is definitely being explored. It's definitely being pushed. There's a lot of big interest in it on the international scene and here as well. I think a lot of the issues here come with that beer is regulated at a federal level. Alcohol is regulated at a federal level, and a lot of them are very, very hesitant to jeopardize that side of things. So when we see beer distributors in Nevada really lobby for the right to have a 3-tier system and only be, the people that can distribute, and then Nevada opens up and legalizes, and then nobody comes forward to want to be a THC distributor and a beer distributor, that tells me that they're likely very risk adverse still. So when that risk aversion kind of gets cut down by some of these triggering events, with the Congress thinking of either protecting banking in the industry, where this is a hugely cash business, so banking is a problem, or they start to protect states' rights even more, so that the DOJ won't go after it. There's only one line item in the budget that says that the DOJ doesn't get funding to go after states for this. That's pretty rickety, and a lot of people are still scared of that. So as those triggering events kind of happen, that risk mitigation happens, and I think you're going to start to see some of these companies really start looking at why not go now.
Right. Yeah. So something I've been thinking about personally since the outbreak started is how every time I see the Nielsen and IRI numbers come out, they've been pretty consistently showing throughout the outbreak, the pandemic, I don't know what we're going to call it, that at least in terms of alcohol, the COVID, at least in terms of alcohol, what's been gaining the most share is, wine to some extent, and liquor by very far is growing much more quickly. Beer is growing. Yeah, so there's a bang for your buck issue, but one of the things that I've been thinking about is maybe this might sound silly, but just packaging efficiency, right? Like if I want to reduce the number of trips to the store, there's an efficiency associated with having just a smaller volume, and beer is big and heavy, right? Like if you want to get the same amount of alcohol, a fifth of vodka has, I think it's supposed to be about 17 drinks in it, and there's that's falling in between two very heavy packages, a 12-pack of beer or a 24-pack of beer. That's much heavier, right? So if you want to cram a lot of alcohol into a quick trip, and only have one trip a week, maybe a couple trips a month to the store, one thing is that it's easier to do that with a heavier or a more concentrated form of alcohol, like liquor or wine. And so, what I'm getting to in terms of the cannabis conversation is cannabis is very light, right? It's extremely light. You can carry
distributors know that.
Yeah, exactly. So, so absolutely, beer distributors would love to get their hands on something so very light and that they could fit a lot of on their trucks. But in terms of consumers and their ability to have this stuff, it's not tremendously expensive per occasion, or what session? What do we say? For
I guess
one time,
yeah.
Okay. So an occasion is not tremendously expensive, and it's coming down, right? Cannabis prices are coming down all the time, so they're becoming less expensive, and really easy to transport. Has a really long shelf life, right? Can you sit a gram of cannabis on your shelf for 6 months?
It will eventually start to lose some potency and have some issues with moisture and everything, but it's not nearly like the light beers, the shelf stability of some of those, where I think Corona's up to 90 days now with some engineering or other things. But I think you bring up some interesting points. We're definitely seeing that budget side come out as people both economize for, smaller. So what can I get for a $10 bill? Because that's what's in my pocket. And then there's the other side of I'm going to buy in bulk. And we're starting to see bulk become an option as scale is achieved. There's just not enough flour there to get people an ounce for a reasonable price. That's starting to come down. We're starting to see that in Canada as they ship whole ounces for $120. And that other thing is that shipping. So that direct to consumer model is vastly different. And now with COVID, we've seen that introduced in some states here. So curbside pickup, other things that kind of break down this dispensary monopoly on route to market. So a lot of things wrapped up into this health emergency that are very, very different than the last health emergency that cannabis faced in the vape crisis. We didn't see many people shift their preferences there. We haven't seen many people shift their preferences here, but we are seeing that the economic impacts of this crisis are what are shifting consumer sentiment. So they are looking for those, kind of grab and go products at a lower price point. Companies are coming to market with those lower price points. 20 milligram packages of edibles instead of the full 100. 0.1s, 0.25 cartridges instead of 0.5 cartridges, 0.1 cartridge or 1 gram cartridges that were the norm. So a lot of cannabis innovation around how to structure itself to really apply itself to the consumer market that is kind of cost conscious, or building out that full price curve. And I think we've seen that cannabis, like beer, is a very sticky good in people's baskets. It's one of the last to leave your basket when you become unemployed, and it's one of the first things you pick up when you become employed again. So it's had relatively healthy returns here during this time, despite some shutdown in states like Massachusetts and Nevada, obviously. But those are all interesting points. And thinking about it from that side, from this beer side, it as a light product that distributors can easily carry, and they are already in a very regulated space with a large amount of space themselves, warehouse space that has tight security and all sorts of things. Those are things that states are looking for and wanting. So, beer is very much positioned to want to take part in THC. They're just still figuring out how, and I think there does need to be recognition that they are different. You can't just go at it with the same mindset. These are very different consumer mindsets in some senses, and very different occasions in some senses. I don't think the microdosing mamas that are kind of taking a milligram here or there to kind of take the edge off, that might have been wine in the past. It might still be wine, but there are other occasions where they might mix even more. So it's daily playing out in a very interesting way, and that's kind of why economics is coming to bear.
Right. So one of the questions that we got was about, is there a ABV percentage for cannabis? And so first off, there isn't ABV per se because there's no alcohol in it, but I think that the question is about concentration. And can you talk a little bit about how concentration is measured in cannabis?
Yeah, and I guess first that is to say that there is a very large knowledge gap in the traditional, or in a typical newly interested or kind of curious consumer. And that knowledge gap often gets filled either by friends or the bud tender. And that's a really, really important point of contact for them. I would say that you should be able to go into a dispensary and ask the questions you want, tell them what you want out of a product or are thinking. They should be asking you questions about it, and you should leave with a product that you like. So that's all to say that there's a very large hole when you go to shelf. When I go to shelf for beer, I kind of know what I'm looking for. I've known that since 21. I just have years of building up that knowledge. There's a little bit less here, and that starts with that kind of what's normal, what's an occasion, what's a typical use. We're starting to see things like Keith Vila's beer. I hate to bring it up again, but that 10 milligrams is their serving that hits kind of like a light beer. The saying in the industry is start low, go slow. So, really start with a low milligram. There are 2s, there are 1 milligram offerings out there. So micro dosing that will start you off if you're very kind of apprehensive. We've all had friends or have had ourselves a bad edible experience. So you can very much start low and then ramp up there. But the equivalence of, a 10 milligram to a beer or a light beer might hold true just because of how it's being ingested and used by your body right now. 10 milligrams is probably a lot for a newbie. There's also going to be a difference between people, just as there is in alcohol, but that kind of 5 milligram range would be something that I would say would get you a buzz of a beer or two. And again, this is kind of an interesting product, right? Unlike a beer where you have a beer and then 20 minutes later you have another beer, and 20 minutes later maybe you have another beer, and you step up gradually throughout your night. Cannabis is really kind of, you hit it and you're there, and that's a different economic structure. We're dealing with a different need then.
Right. So something that I've been fascinated about with regard to cannabis is how I don't know if all products are the same, but one thing that I've seen in terms of discussion of flower is that you can get very precise analytes in terms of, this gram of flour contains 15% THC, 20, 30% THC, and it's extremely clear. And if you understand the what you're looking for in terms of how much THC is in it, and how much CBD or whatever other cannabinoid, I'm not going to say it right,
Cannabinoids.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Whatever else is in there, you can really precisely get at what it is that you want, and you can shop for that. You can get a deal for that. If you shop around, I gather. And the thing that concerns me with regard to comparison to beer or wine or liquor for that matter is that actually, as I know you know, but maybe not everybody watching knows, there isn't a requirement that any kind of, that beer have an ABV listed, for example. You don't have to list ABV on your beer. You don't have to say how many calories are in the beer. You don't have to say
ingredients.
Right. You don't have to. Now you can. It's optional. You're allowed to put those things on if you want. And
nice.
Then if you do, you have to have that be accurate then, of course. But there's a lot of beers out there on shelves that don't list ABV, and they don't have to. So,
and you can be off by a slight margin in beer.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have actually seen analytes that indicate some beers that do list ABV are off by a wide margin, but that's neither here nor there.
Obviously.
The point that I was trying to make is that for markets to function efficiently, more information for all parties concerned is better. And it makes sense that somebody would want to pursue a product in a market that's very transparent and has all of that information available. We know in cannabis that, whether the federal government is requiring it or not, most suppliers who are selling flour are putting on that what's the percentage THC content, and that's just by weight, right? And then for folks who are selling other things, like you mentioned in our friend, in my case, acquaintance, I have met Keith B. I wouldn't call him a friend, but because I don't know him that well, but he's an acquaintance. He's making a beer with 10 milligrams of THC, and other things like that do tend to list the content either by percentage weight or by total content in terms of the number of milligrams of THC. Beer currently doesn't have that level of transparency, and so that's something that I've personally been concerned about with regard to consumers making the choice of how much alcohol do you want to consume, how many calories do you want to consume. It's definitely easy to go with something that you really understand.
Yeah, and I think cannabis has an inherent advantage there, as testing is required of every batch. So, and that is deep testing. That is heavy metal testing all the way down to terpenes, all sorts of things. THC at the very top as part of the main cannabinoid, the one that's psychoactive, as CBD is not psychoactive, or there are others than CBG, CBN, stuff that we're starting to figure out also, as now research is starting to be allowed at some different levels that hasn't been allowed in the past. That science is advancing, and it's finding those thresholds and those analytics and really applying them. So when we look at a market, a wholly legalized market like Canada, their packaging doesn't look like beer, right? It is heavily labeled with government warnings and statistics. It looks more like a packet of cigarettes. So there is a large amount of information that comes out on any single product that is out there on shelf. It has a whole background. It is tracked from seed to sale with some of these tracking softwares and blockchain technology and all sorts of other things. So there is a lot of information out there, and the consumer can really dig in. If you're looking for a cannabinoid profile or a certain terpene profile, or if you're using it for health reasons or a seizure mitigation, you can really dial in on one of those cannabinoids and then find a product that has those in it in a pretty niche market. So that information is just really, there's a wealth of information out there on this because of the testing requirements, because of the large amount of science that goes into it. That's not to say that there's not science in beer. There's genetics in hops and all sorts of other things. Genetics on this side of the plant is rapidly developing as they do try to, as people are trying to increase the amount of THC, because the things that we hear from consumers a lot are they shop for sale and high THC. Almost exclusively. And when you do that, you're kind of saying, I don't really care what I get, but eventually the market's going to get to a point where you do care what you get. And there's going to be that information available, or the person that comes to the market that's a little hesitant and has a very specific need can come to the market and find a product that's pretty niche and will fit it. We hear all the time from medical consumers that really don't like smoking. They don't like having to use this product because of the side effects, the smell, other things, and there are states that limit formats that would allow you to go away from that. But the appeal of those cannabinoids is still there. The health benefit is still there, and they take that because they do see the benefit and the clarity and the information that they're given.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take one more question from the ones I received, and if you want, Andy, we can take another one of the ones you've got, or else we can wrap up. So a question here is, are there any occasions that are definitely safe for beer and not at risk of moving over to cannabis? And so first off, we've talked about how I think that there are pretty safe, reliable guardrails in terms of how much the total amount of potential loss to cannabis is. I think that in terms of percentages, it's very low, like you said, Andy. But material, the potential is there for risk. At least for now, I don't see the laws changing around on-premise. I think that bars and restaurants aren't likely to start allowing smoking again. They've never allowed cannabis that I'm aware of, and I think that it's pretty universally folks' preference that secondhand smoke not be allowed. Now, there are other ways to consume cannabis, but what I was getting to is, it seems to me that the on-premise occasion is one that is relatively safe for beer, so alcohol for now. There's potential loss and ongoing loss of beer share to wine and liquor in both on and off premise. But I think that one area that's safe, at least for now, is on premise. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, I think you're correct in the short term. I also think that presumes that the on-premise of today continues to look the way it does.
Right.
We're not all in bars right now.
The way it is right now, because the way it is right now is crazy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, not now, but like how bars were in general, like when I was raised in Wisconsin, just in a bar.
Right.
Yeah, so that on-premise is an interesting thing. I don't think that a regular liquor bar is going to be able to soon get a license to sell cannabis on-premise. That's just going to be way too tough and further down the line for right now. The more likely thing is we're going to see on-premise cannabis only, and that's already starting to pop up. In Chicago, we had something that came across as a consideration of allowing tobacco shops to allow on-premise use. The problem there is that they want a license to sell and weren't getting them. And two, the cannabis consumer and the tobacco consumer are just way too different. They just don't enjoy being in the same space because of how they're structured, arranged, et cetera, et cetera. So cannabis is that gets back to kind of what channels are available in cannabis. Right now, it is heavily concentrated in dispensaries. And that is very much guarded by the people that are already in the industry because they've paid a lot of money for those. Somewhere between $3 to $8 million in California right now, depending on location, as they resell them. And I will say the market for dispensary licenses is out there. There are large companies that all they do is apply for free licenses, or the open licenses, and they just harvest them because they know that they will be able to sell them. So that dispensary monopoly is getting broken down daily. And during this COVID outbreak, we've seen those dispensaries ask for some liberties to kind of break out of their four walls, whether it's click and collect curbside, possibly some delivery as, started to get instituted. Delivery's usually been on the medical side, as you can get a 30-day supply and shipped to you and it's from a doctor, et cetera, et cetera. There's more guardrails in place. But, black market delivery is really, really popular. In this environment that we're now in, where we're all shopping online, we're now shopping for goods online that we weren't before, just by necessity. We're more and more comfortable shopping online. So if I know what I want and I don't need to go into the dispensary, that's a lot easier to just have it show up at my door an hour later, if I know what I'm looking for and all those kind of things. So I would say the question is kind of premised on the dispensary model as it is getting broken down, and there will be on premise. There already is in LA. There already is in Colorado. Some lounges. Lowell's Lounge in LA has a full bud tender come to your table. They'll show you how to roll a joint. They'll show you how to pack a bowl. They'll serve your meal. They'll do whatever you kind of like. You can hang out. You can smoke. You can do whatever you like. Other people have gotten around it with kind of social clubs where they kind of own the space and everybody has a membership. So it's kind of based on this fact of today's channels for cannabis aren't going to be tomorrow's channels for cannabis. And today's channels for alcohol are not going to be tomorrow's channels for alcohol. So whether or not the two merge, I'm not sure. That's a long, long way off. But for right now, cannabis is definitely building up this alternate channels of use that are going to start to look like and potentially rival some of those beer channels.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. Well, we're at about 40 minutes. If you got any more questions that you think demand answering, or else we can wrap this up. What do you think?
I just have one more here that is, will there be macro weed? Will we be able to just, like big weed, big cannabis?
Is there already?
Yeah. They're all already. Will we be able to just farm Kansas once a year and grab all the oil we need for the entire year? And that's not that now, as every state has to exist within itself. You do not want to cross state boundaries. You are stepping into very much a federal world of hurt. So each economy is contained within itself, within a state. It can't go across state lines, and that's hurting some states, right? Oregon has this oversupply, this glut that they just can't get rid of, and it just crashes the price every October, every Croptober. So those things are going to need to be addressed, especially as people want to defend the space that they're in, that they've paid to be in. And on the other side, there is a lot of money in this. John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, is on a board of cannabis now. There are a lot of lobbying efforts going on. There are a lot of big beer distributors, the big ones, the biggest names in the industry are in Washington, are in Springfield, Illinois, lobbying for those things. So when you see that and you see their ability to go to scale very quickly, that just kind of shows you what's ahead. Right now, Illinois is very, very constrained in its market because it made its market based on the current medical market. Only the current medical dispensaries could sell legal on Jan 1. So that has really constrained the market because it's very limiting in having those dispensaries connected to growers that are trying to expand their canopy space. So capital outlay. It's not going to ramp up smoothly. It's going to take these steps as more and more canopy space comes online. 16 weeks later, we get plants on shelf or whatever it is. And that's much easier to do when you have large amounts of capital. Illinois, you need something like $1.5 million in access to capital if you want to even talk about getting one of these newer dispensary licenses. That's a huge, huge barrier to entry, especially in an industry that is so rooted historically and should be rooted now in social justice. Illinois as the gold standard of social justice so far, I hope it's passed by the next state. So giving all people a chance to come into this industry is a challenge right now, as it's being overtaken by these large multi-state operators. So there already is macro weed. There's already micro weed. There already are very organic and earthy and small farms. California has like 7 to 10 designations of farm size, grower size that you want to be. So you can scale to whatever you want to be, but that scale and that ability is attracting a lot of money from outside the industry, from inside the industry. We're seeing a lot of consolidation after this financial crisis has hit a lot of companies that were kind of mid-stride or were struggling or had skeletons in their closet from the past when they were either gray market or black market before them. So that's still all kind of shaking out, but we do need to be very aware of who's moving into this space. Otherwise, it is quickly consolidating. So that is definitely something we're looking at. I think the analogy here is kind of like beer and craft, right? We've kind of had a craft bubble almost where the middle is almost disappearing. You're either in 1 or 2 states or you're in all the states. And within the last couple of years, when I was at Constellation studying craft, we saw those middle guys just get hurt. They get their hands slapped when they tried to overreach. Surly in Minnesota trying to expand it into the Midwest. Sitting in Chicago, I saw Surly, and my wife's from Minnesota. I've enjoyed Surly up in Minnesota. It's fantastic. But I can tell you, I have better IPAs down the street in Chicago in 3 to 4 locations. So we saw some of those middle-sized craft growers really get slapped by this economic impact of the last couple of years for them. So that's still shaking out too, as you know. So that side, and then the analogy on the cannabis side as well.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be really interesting. Switching just back to beer for a moment, as we come out of the coronavirus outbreak, there have been a lot of big winners, and there have been a lot of, for lack of a kinder term, losers. Folks who have had their business just completely shut down because it was all on premise, for example. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the companies who have done really well during the outbreak, because they were poised with great distribution in big packs, what are they going to do to leverage that success into greater success coming out of the outbreak? That's not tremendously germane to the topic we've been talking about, but to me, it's a very fascinating idea. I want to wrap this up. So to everybody who came along to send us questions and to watch today, thank you very much. This video is going to still be up for people to rewatch, so feel free to send the link around to anybody who wasn't able to attend. Thanks to my friend and my guest today, Andy.
Anytime, bud.
It's an insightful as always. All right.
Yeah.
So that's all for today's Ask a Beer Economist. Thanks very much.
Peace, love, and cannabis.